This is Andre Koen. I want to say welcome to this discussion on a house divided. And what we know is that this comes from an old adage that a house divided cannot stand. And so when we think about this house divided, I really want to spend some time looking at four aspects of kind of these pillars that kind of support the structures of racism and oppression. First is this recognition that racism needs no racists, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. But this notion that people oftentimes will say, "Well, I'm not racist," so either there is no racism or I play no part in it. And I would like to suggest, and I'll make an argument today that, or I'll state a position that that at this point, racism doesn't really need racists because it is systematic, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. We'll talk a little bit about this notion of critical cognition. So, how do you address the mental models that keep the perpetuation of racism and systems of oppression going? So how do you confront those? We'll also talk about the myth of reverse discrimination. This is something that oftentimes is talked about in small groups or in small corners of organizations. But what we want to do is really talk about it in the fullness of day. So bring that out of the shadows and into the light and really give some attention to that. And then lastly is this notion of truth telling, the art of fair witnessing. And so how do you engage with historically marginalized communities in ways that are helpful to them, right? And we'll talk about that, the art of fair witnessing. So the first thing I want to bring to your attention is this notion that Newton's first law of motion, which is a thing at rest will remain at rest until acted upon by a force, and a force, and once something is in motion, if there are no actors preventing that, it will continue in motion, right? So this notion of perpetual motion oftentimes is something that is talked about. So we'll talk about that. And I know many of you are like, well, Andre, what does that have to do with other things? And I will say that the system, the way that systemic racism has been baked into our society, there needs to be this understanding that we have to be active to push against that, to uproot that, right? So understanding the notion of systemic racism. There's a 4-minute video that I'd encourage you to watch that talks about some of those fundamental ways in which systemic racism is embedded in our society. We won't take the time now to watch this, but I do want to kind of help us reflect on the fact that redlining, blockbusting, voter suppression, income inequality, school to prison pipeline, gerrymandering, and immigration are all things that we should be engaging if we want change. Because if we don't, then these balls, so to speak, keep rolling. The next thing I want to talk about is this critical cognition, these mental models that keep us or keep the systems of racism and oppression in place. The first is us and them, right? So this whole idea of othering, and you'll see that that's a common theme in some of these mental models, right? So it's either or, right? So it's either this thing or that thing, when in fact it could be both and, right? The notion of being right versus wrong, good versus evil, that these polarities are oftentimes problematic because we live in these gray areas, right? And then this notion of collectivism versus individualism. And how do we strike that balance? And so oftentimes, particularly dominant cultures see themselves as individuals or as as individually collective, where oftentimes targeted cultures or cultures that are responding to that dominant culture see themselves as collectives, mostly because the dominant group typically sees them as a collective group. And then this notion of what is an in group and out group, and how do you operate between those. And then lastly, this notion of merit, right? And so that people earn what they get, or they get what they deserve. And I would suggest that is there's some problems with this. Purely with this idea of merit, because Lord knows I do not want to get everything that I deserve. So there, that is something to consider, right? And so when we think about this, when these models are in action, how does this impact people, right? So think about that. And so how do we get beyond those mental models? So I like to go to the DMIS, which is the Developmental Model of Intercultural Sensitivity. It's a little old, but it's a classic, right? And it helps us to recognize that there are things that we know we don't know, and then our blind spots. And then we also recognize how we need to move to be more effective, to get a better purview of the world, right? And so if I'm looking at my small piece of the world, I may be just looking at the world with a denial of difference, right? And so the greater my scope, the more skills I get, the more I'm able to kind of integrate myself into multiple cultures in multiple ways. So we'll talk a little bit about this notion of the myth of reverse discrimination, which is this notion that white people are the new oppressed group. And so there's a ton to unpack here. But what I want us to really think about is not only just listening to the words, but listening to the intent and to the hurt that many of these stories represent. And so there's a website, the Whiteness Project, that I've drawn some of these pieces from, and very enlightening. So one question I oftentimes ask is, what might be motivating these individuals to act or think the way they do? And so once you've watched those videos, you can appreciate that. Also, this notion of that there's little data that suggests that this reverse discrimination is happening. However, I do believe that the feelings are real. That the feelings are something that we should be paying attention to. And so when we think about white codes, when we think about the Crown laws, which is what people can do with their hair in professional settings, when we think about the black codes, we think about the 13th Amendment, the real question is, what is the white version of the talk? And typically the talk is for black and brown folks, and indigenous folks, how to operate in the world so that you are safe, right? And so there are questions about that. And then lastly is this idea of truth telling and the art of fair witnessing. And the root of this part of the presentation really focuses on the importance of being seen and being heard. And so one of the things that the George Floyd the Derek Chauvin case involving the death of George Floyd that really struck me was the feeling of being seen and heard, given what that video showed, what the testimony said, the folks who testified against the officer. There was no joy in that for me, but it really was. It was somewhat settling to hear other people see and hear what I saw and what I heard and what I felt and what I experienced oftentimes on a regular basis. So just wanted to point that out. We'll talk a lot more in the session about this notion of what do we see, right? What do we see? And so this is an exercise that I do with folks to encourage them to kind of question what it is that they see or see things differently. This is an optical illusion that that I've been using. And again, the question is, what do you see? And what you see will dictate, in a large part, what you're willing to invest in, what you're willing to do, right? So important stuff. And then, because when we don't see things rightly, then we come up with these excuses for all sorts of stuff, right? Many folks will say that the sagging pants are unacceptable. As simultaneously, I find it interesting that many of those same folks oftentimes don't wear their mask properly, right? And so that becomes important. And we also have to recognize this notion of gaslighting. And gaslighting is basically making people doubt themselves, right? And I think it was capitalized in the song in the 90s called "It Wasn't Me," where this guy was caught cheating and he says, it wasn't me, or he was in the wrong place at the wrong time and he says it wasn't me, right? So really this idea of gaslighting. And so when we come to this conversation of Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, this is one of those things where gaslighting can occur. And so it's important for us to recognize that and address it. And in the All Lives Matter or the Blue Lives Matter community, it is also important to listen to the intention, even if the words are a little bit awkward, because particularly if it's not undermining Black Lives Matter, right? So this notion that we have to hear a little bit beyond the words requires this idea of fair witnessing, being an objective observer of reality. And so how do you do that? You see them, right? You hear them, you act with them, and whoever the them is, the other is, you engage with those things in ways that allow you to hear, to see, and to act alongside people as opposed to for them or on them, right? And then this whole notion of the hidden wholeness. There's a gentleman by the name of Parker J. Palmer who deals with this idea of hidden wholeness. And so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. And that ends our presentation for The House Divided. So I look forward to engaging with you in this workshop. Look forward to seeing who we become as we continue these conversations. My name is Andre Koen. I look forward to working with you soon. Thanks. Bye.